All right, welcome everybody. My name is Noah Woodward, and I'm going to be doing a quick overview, about 6 minutes overview on the Synoptic Gospels. What we'll be covering in this quick video is just a couple things. One, who wrote first? Who was the first? Uh, what was the first gospel written? And two, how is John different compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke? So, who wrote the first gospel? Most scholars nowadays agree on Markan priority, and that just means that Mark wrote first. And there are six pieces of evidence that would suggest that Mark wrote first. The first being that the stories and details in Mark are actually longer than Matthew. Now, Mark is actually a shorter book than Matthew, but the stories and details in Mark are longer than Matthew, which would suggest that Matthew actually abbreviated Mark. Second piece of evidence is a triple tradition, and that just means that the story is included in all three synoptics. In those cases, when uh, Matthew and Luke don't agree with one another, when one or the other differs from Mark, which would suggest that they're not using each other as a source, but they're actually using Mark as a source. Number three, the order of events in Mark seem to be original. So when Mark departs from Mark's order, Luke actually supports Mark's order. And when Luke departs from Mark's order, Matthew supports it. Number four, Mark writes less polished than Matthew and Luke, which would suggest that maybe Matthew and Luke, they seem to be polishing over Mark's writings to kind of smooth it out. The fifth piece of evidence would be that Matthew and Luke frequently alter readings of Mark. So, an example, Mark 1:12, Mark says that the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness. And compare that to Matthew and Luke's account, where they say the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness. And also, Matthew 6:5 could not do any miracles, compared to Matthew 13:58. He did not do any miracles. So, it's just smoothing out the language a little bit. And the last piece of evidence is that Mark kept the original Aramaic translation, which was um, the language that Jesus spoke. For example, Mark 5:41, Talitha Kum, and Mark 14:36, Abba. All right, so now what are the similarities uh, in the synoptics and compared to John? Why is John different? Well, first of all, synoptic actually means to see the same. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke have very similar accounts and very similar types of writing compared to John. 90% of Mark's gospel is actually found in either Matthew or Luke. A lot of their sayings and the narrative material is very similar, and in some spots it's word for word. Whereas John's gospel is 90% unique material. Okay, so what are the similarities in the synoptics compared to John? There's three different kind of categories that John is different. One is style. Mark starts his gospel with the public ministry of Jesus. Matthew starts his gospel with the genealogy and infancy of Jesus. And Luke starts his gospel with the John the Baptist's birth and Jesus' birth, and then a genealogy. And John starts at the beginning, reflecting Genesis 1. He talks about the Word made flesh. The Word was God, and the Word was with God, making Jesus equal and distinct from God. He also uses dualistic language like belief, rejection, light, darkness, truth, and lies. Category that John is different is in plot. John puts the cleansing of the temple very early on in his gospel, whereas in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, That is shown as being one of the very last weeks of Jesus' ministry, not some of the first. Also, John starts Jesus' ministry not with baptism, but with the call of the disciples and turning water to wine. Category that John is different in is in the presentation of Jesus' words and deeds. Um, Only John has Jesus using these double amens like verily, verily. There is no exorcisms in John, which is a major feature in the Synoptics. John has long discourses of Jesus talking, but not many parables. And he uses a lot of unique material. For example, uh, the accounts with Nicodemus in John 3, the Samaritan woman in John 4, the washing of disciples' feet in John 13, but no Lord's Supper, and the post-resurrection appearance to Mary Magdalene alone in John 20. So these are just some of the differences between the Synoptics versus the Gospel of John. Finished up. We covered who wrote first. We talked about Mark and priority and the 6 pieces of evidence that suggest that Mark wrote first. And we talked about the three different categories that John is different and how the synoptics compare to John. Thank you for listening. I hope to find you in the next one.